Hey guys, hope you all are doing well. I've been learning a lot recently, so here's a lot of things that I've been learning. So one of the biggest learning curves I've had in my classroom as an ESOL teacher has been Spanish. So since a lot of my students speak Spanish, I have been picking up some of the languages. I've been using the words grande, pequeño, mayor, menor, respuesta, problema, silencio, lots of other words, lots of numbers. Yeah, so before taking this job, I've had practically zero Spanish. I knew numbers and letters, but none of the words. So one of the things that I've learned a lot is math academic related vocabulary to Spanish. But I would say the most important phrase I've learned is como se dice, because my students are very helpful and they're eager for me to learn Spanish as they are eager to learn English. Well, they are not always seeming eager, but they do like learning English. Another thing I learned about is in my Critics of Democracy class about the different types of criticism of democracy that there is, and also the roots thereof. So, for example, conservatism. Many think conservatism is looking at tradition, and so as a result, there probably have always been conservatives, and people in opposition to that are more recent movements than conservatism. However, the movement towards conservatism didn't take a broad spectrum, like singular movement, until after the Enlightenment occurred. Burke founded the modern conservative movement, 18th century to the present. And so, because of this, we have a wing of politics that is conservative. It's not been a bunch of conservatives with some offshoots, as we traditionally tend to think, with conservatism being the original position. And this differs from democratic criticism in the form of nationalism, which also differs from criticism in the form of communism. Each different one has its distinct forms. So conservatism is all about maintaining the roots and traditions in terms of religious order, in terms of political order, cultural order, that type of order. Nationalism is more focused on specifically the ethnic, cultural aspects of tradition and preventing change in that regard. But it does not care as much about the religious aspect. It doesn't care as much about many of the other aspects. And then communism focuses on equality in terms of economics and in terms of materials, not caring about tradition or at all. So those are how each of those differences from democracy are distinct. And then in the class we looked at how Islamic fundamentalism kind of can relate to these different aspects, and also modern nationalist movements in, say, India and China are reminiscent of European nationalism today. So it's interesting. A lot of the movements today going on are very similar to the 19th and early 20th century in Europe, what we faced over there. And then in my political institutions and policy class, we've been studying a lot about the policy process. So basically, in your government class, you learn about the process for how a bill becomes a law. Someone proposes it, it goes through a committee, then it goes through one House of Congress and the other House of Congress, then the president signs it. While the policy process is a lot more complex than that. Theorists have many different models as to explain why different pieces of legislation come up and the outside influences that affect specific policymakers. The predominant theory is the idea of policy streams, that certain three things have to be in line for a policy to be able to take effect. The people, the politics, and the policy itself. So the people in power have to be the ones that would bring forth a certain policy. The political situation surrounding an issue needs to be right for an issue to become prevalent. Like, for example, say immigration. For immigration reform to happen, you need a lot of people who are heavily invested in immigration. You need a political situation where people think this is an issue we need to address now. And then the policy itself. Policy needs to be made that would be accepted by the people and meets the situation that would take effect. So that's how the policy streams work. You don't usually get a policy unless multiple parts of the stream sort of come into confluence. And as a result, different actors in the political process have different amounts of influence. Lobbyists can sort of propose legislation, propose alternatives, but they're not going to be as good at setting the agenda. The president would be a really good example of being able to set the agenda. He says, I want to do this, people hear, and people listen. Meanwhile, people in Congress, there's like 535 representatives. It's hard for a congressman to get their voice out, So it's hard for them to set the agenda. Rather, they're good at proposing alternatives. Instead of let's doing this bill, let's try this bill instead. And so looking at how different actors in the political process also affect legislation in its crafting and its ending. And so what I did with the final project of that course is that since all this policy was focusing on the federal level, I made it focus on the local level. And I studied school consolidation in Rockbridge County, my favorite topic that I tend to look at for almost every paper, and compare that local level scenario to the federal level stream to sort of tease out what the differences would be using my example as a case study. The results were very interesting. It kind of shows that the roles were kind of reversed. That in the federal level, the people themselves, the electorate, don't have a lot of influence. They're mainly on the reacting end of things. But in the situation of the Rockbridge County consolidation issue and a lot of local government issues where the people are extensively affected and they're very close to the issue itself, they have a lot more authority. And also likewise, county governments, the board of supervisors, which would be your equivalent of the executive branch per se, doesn't really shape the agenda. They merely propose alternatives and say we want this thing to happen, this thing to happen. We'll just refuse to vote for funding whatever board gives a proposal. Meanwhile, the proposals themselves are brought up by, like, say, the school board, Department of Social Services, different local governing aspects that set the agenda, while the board of supervisors reacts at trying to propose alternatives that would meet their budgetary needs. So the roles within the local government themselves are kind of reversed of what would be the federal level, and then the power distribution is kind of almost flipped, because you have the people have a lot more power while the local government has less power, and then compared to the federal level, and then you have the executive and the legislative branches effectively swapping compared to what the federal level would be. All of this to say that it is a lot more complicated than just someone proposes a bill, it goes through committee, gets voted, goes into law. There is a lot more to it. That being said, I am looking forward to next semester where I will be studying how to run a campaign and bureaucratic politics to sort of be able to tie that in and see how all that works. And then I'm done with grad school. But yeah, those are the things I've been learning. Spanish, democracy critics, and policy. Anyway, looking forward to hearing your responses. Wiedersehen.